So thank you for joining the Orchid Advisors webinar series. Today's session is specific to cash management and working capital opportunities. We hope there's a lot of good material that you'll pick up today for either enhancing your operational processes that benefit working capital, or some accounting principles and cash management principles that will also be beneficial to the organization. Administratively, I want to say thank you to the approximate 100 people that are joining our call today. Our session will go approximately 45 minutes. There is a question option that you have through the webinar service. If you want to submit a question, please feel free to do so. In addition, please keep your phones on mute if you do have to put us on hold for any reason. And your particular company has sound recording or music playing that will play throughout the video, so we ask that you not do that. Also, if you want a copy of these materials when we're done, they will be made available on the Orchid website. And of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to give us a call. So on the call today, we have three individuals. Myself, introduce myself as John Ryberg. I'm CEO of Orchid Advisors and a 5-time author on various topics related to business management and compliance. By way of background, I have approximately 20 years of business consulting experience for firms like Ernst & Young, Protiviti, and spent a number of years as the Chief Compliance Officer and Head of Internal Audit for a number of public companies as well. My focus really is on supply chain optimization, cost optimization, internal controls, Sarbanes-Oxley, and internal audit. Additionally, on the call, we have with us Jeff Grody, who's a principal in our firm. He has a legal background, approximately 35 years experience, 9 years of which at Colt as their general counsel, and 25 years in private law practice. He is very experienced in the area of commercial contracts, intellectual property, corporate and commercial transactions, restructuring, turnarounds, and so forth. Michelle Ingram has approximately 15 years of experience working for organizations such as Bank of America, Latham & Watkins, Cigna, and Disney. And she brings to us a lot of our financial analytic expertise that's used to assist clients with working capital optimization. Just one quick slide on Orchid Advisors as a firm. We are a strategic management consultancy focused on operational excellence derived from strategy, internal control, and data analytics. What does that really mean? At the heart of our firm and our methodologies really is the concept of internal controls. Whether or not we're talking about operations, cash management, accounting, legal matters, we are strong believers in internal controls as enablers of making the business achieve its objectives. The benefit to our firm is we provide economies of a boutique firm with the depth and breadth of Big Four and top-tier legal experience. Our primary goal is to solve C-level challenges related to business performance matters, working capital, and governance and control. You'll see in the middle column really the focus of today's discussions, and that is on working capital planning, rationalizing and benchmarking costs, cash recovery and financial leakage, receivables and credit management, optimize inventory, and also within that bucket, but not covered today, would be navigating bankruptcy or severe liquidity issues. Just so everybody knows on the call, we as a firm do provide all of these services on a contingent fee basis. So what's our agenda? We'd really like to define working capital just so that we all have a basic understanding. The definition of working capital itself is pretty simplistic, but I want to look at it from an operational perspective as well as an accounting perspective. We're going to spend some time understanding the drivers of cash and working capital management, talk about indicators of working capital optimization needs, look at some macroeconomic trends and the impact of growing inventories on an organization's ability to manage cash, as well as trends in the credit markets and how that's also impacting organizations. We'll take a closer look at the key areas that I've mentioned, and then we'll go into a case study. So our webinar objectives, just re-summarized quickly, right, is to establish that uniform understanding of working capital, dissect the primary sources of working capital optimization, and review the methods in a case study for working capital optimization. So let's start out with that basic definition, right? Working capital is a measure of liquidity or the efficiency and overall health of the business. It's the money that's available for the day-to-day operations of the business. And so why is that important, right? Organizations need to focus on working capital for a number of different reasons, whether they be internal pressure or external pressure. Some examples of those are as follows. Organizations that are seeing rapid growth, significant growth in sales, tend to have a need for expanded inventory balances. And it's not too uncommon for the investments in inventory, R&D, new products, marketing, and so forth to burn through cash, and the extreme revenue growth provide a somewhat of a misnomer or a false sense of security that cash will always be available. That's not necessarily the case. The other internal pressures driving need for focus on working capital are execution. The flip side of that, so poor management of accounts payable, poor management of inventory, weak systems, and so forth. From an external perspective, it really comes down to, is the organization getting cost pressure from its suppliers? Is it needing to pay more for the same raw materials or goods and services that it used to pay less for? Or are there new entrants to the market putting pressure on pricing and causing the organization to cut its prices, or has demand slipped for any particular reason? Those are some of the key drivers that put pressure on working capital. The formula for working capital is pretty basic, right? It's current assets minus current liabilities, and some of those are shown down below here, right? The primary constituents are cash and marketable securities, accounts receivable and credit, inventories, and accounts payable. So let's take a look at some of the questions that you might want to ask yourself, right? As we look at the drivers of cash and working capital management, right? This is an introspective review. Inside of the organization, there's a number of different types of assets that managers are required to manage. Sorry about that. They are people and information assets, there's supply chain and customer assets, physical assets such as the building itself, product and intellectual capital assets, and then there's the financial assets. It's the financial assets that we're focusing on today. And if you look at this slide, you'll see four key areas: inventory management, AP, credit management, and cost optimization. Let's ask ourselves some of these questions, right? And this is something that a management team can do itself to understand if there's any red flags on the horizon. Are we about to suffer any abnormal working capital pressures? Or are we well managed? So for example, is our inventory growing? And if our inventory is growing, is sales growing at the same pace, at a slower pace? Right? We really want to understand what type of inventory growing. Is it our raw materials, our work in process, or our finished goods balance? For example, we work with a lot of manufacturing companies, and before they implement lean manufacturing, you tend to see very high inventories and work in process, which effectively means that cash is tied up waiting for operations to complete or convert work in process into finished goods. It's a very poor use of cash and can create working capital pressure. So not only do you want to understand, is your inventory growing, but what type of inventory is growing and how is that putting pressure on the organization? And of course, you can measure some of that with your inventory turns as well. Within the accounts payable area, there are many, many questions to ask yourself, and far more than three that are shown here, such as, are we taking advantage of our discounts? A lot of your vendors and customers and so forth will make various credit arrangements one way or the other that can be favorable to the organization. If the accounts payable function is not managed properly, or if your systems don't provide you enough visibility to understand, for example, when you might have received a particular invoice, when you need to pay it, whether or not you're going to trip a threshold for a discount, you might not be taking advantage of those benefits. Do you have standard payment terms? How are you negotiating them? An introspective view at how you're processing invoices, right? The pace at them, and whether or not you have the appropriate internal controls to make sure that you're not paying invoices twice. As you'll see later in the presentation, one of the areas to squeeze cash back out of the organization is performing a duplicate payment study. It's not uncommon to see organizations recover up to about 1% of their spend through a duplicate payments analysis. And then in the credit management area, right, do we have a credit policy? Over the past couple of years, we've seen dramatic swings in availability and access to credit. Well, the same holds true inside of the business, right? How are you managing the credit that you extend to your customers? And so let's take an example of a random consumer products industry that might be growing at an extreme high pace. Your distributors and your customers would want to buy extreme amounts of inventory to be able to meet demand. But do their credit policies align with those needs for inventory? Are they paying on time or not? If those types of things aren't closely managed, you can find yourself in a credit crunch. Right, so for example, the last question there is, will we be able to collect? And then from a cost optimization perspective, and frankly, one of the areas where you can squeeze the most cash out of the organization, we might ask ourselves some of the following questions. We've been in business for a number of years. We've grown our supply base tremendously. Have we looked at our supply base and rationalized it to say, we're buying this particular part number from 14 different companies around the United States. Can we potentially aggregate that supply, find one, maybe two sources of supply, and get significant discounts? In our experience, the optimization of your supply base can return upwards of about 15% of spend. That's pretty significant. Right, and the remaining questions pertain to execution of the purchasing function and who's monitoring spending. So moving on to the next slide, right, let's take a look at the cash conversion cycle. When we mention words or terms like working capital, a lot of people think, oh, well, that's a finance function. That's something that the accountants deal with. Well, that's not necessarily true. The cash conversion cycle basically is the full span of time from when somebody needs to purchase goods to when they're purchased. The inventory comes in, they're converted to saleable finished goods, sold, invoiced, and the cash is collected. The three functional areas of the business that are involved in that cash conversion cycle really are the sales organization, who's responsible for establishing sales and operation planning and the accuracy of demand forecasts, having input into product development, SKU rationalization, contracts, pricing, and so forth. One of the challenges that we see to working capital that's kind of buried within sales, and you might not suspect it, is SKU rationalization. All of a sudden, your sales team wants to meet the needs of every one of their customers, so they're coming up with variations of products in an infinite amount. And that, in turn, drives additional G&A expenditures, R&D expenditures, the purchase of so many different types of raw materials and supplies that your cost structure gets out of whack. So that's an area that surprisingly has an impact on working capital. You might not know it. Typically more on the longer term horizon. Operations has an impact because they're responsible for procurement, sourcing, making sure you have the right sources of supply, and then, of course, inventory management and receiving accuracy. And then finance, where most people think about from a working capital perspective, is really responsible for all of the credit, cash, financing, coming up with the overall cash management plan, and so forth. So all we do is ask you to take a look at this slide, and when you think about working capital optimization, if you were to embark upon a project internal to your company, make sure you bring in all of the different constituents of the cycle. One of the other things that you can do to determine where you stand from a working capital perspective and how small changes in your operational activities benefit the business is to create a model. What you see before you is a basic Excel model that allows us to play around with different variables such as days sales outstanding, inventory balances, days payables outstanding, and your overall impact on working capital. Given the number of finance people are on this call, I'm sure you all understand that everything has a cost, right? There's a cost of capital. Well, by modeling the change in days sales outstanding, for example, as we show here, and speeding up your receivables by just 1 day, in this particular example, shows that there are impacts to cash, right? Over this particular quarter, a 1-day change in DSO resulted in an impact of cash collections faster of $79,000, or net change in capital available of $5,900, right? Now, these are small numbers, but some of the individuals on the call are joining us from billion-dollar organizations where once you add a couple of zeros on there, or you change the ratios and the metrics such as DSO by more than just a day, the savings can be quite dramatic. So make sure you're modeling to understand where you stand and where your opportunities are. What are the indicators of working capital optimization needs? I mentioned some of these at the beginning of the call, right? Number one, economic pressure in times of uncertainty. We're all familiar with the crash back in 2008, right? Where credit got extremely tight, cash was weak, the economy was sinking, right? We had rapid drops in demand, inventories were growing. That's the obvious part. We're going to take a look at some current trends and how things have changed in just a moment. The second of which is unstable or growing cost structure, right? Needing to increase the price to cover margins, right? If you see or find yourself sitting down with your sales team and asking how you can increase prices because you need them to cover margins as opposed to the market will bear additional prices or increased prices, that's a red flag. Also, when demand slows down and production slows down, you might find yourself with unabsorbed overhead costs and, of course, increased sources of supply we mentioned. From an operational perspective, other indicators of working capital needs are limited demand visibility, not knowing how much you're going to be able to sell in the future or at what point. Weak internal controls over inventory, logistics, and the cash credit process. Weak computer systems and weak transaction control. We typically find that weaknesses within the accounts payable, inventory management, accounts receivable, process areas, for example, are most often driven by computer system failures and lead to things like duplicate payments, unapplied credit memos, not taking advantage of your discount terms. Fragmented supply-based tactical purchasing, I mentioned SKU proliferation. And of course, lack of recent leakage analysis or cost benchmarking. In other words, if you haven't performed any kind of a working capital analysis or a duplicate payments analysis inside of your organization in some time, that would signal a need to maybe do so. So let's just take a look at the economic landscape. We have 3 slides here which are going to paint a little bit of a different picture, right? Coming out of 2008 to present, things are changing, but there's still a lot of uncertainty out there, right? Uncertainty means we don't know what's going to happen, and when we don't know what's going to happen, we should manage our working capital more conservatively rather than more aggressively. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Ingram, who's going to take us through the next 3 slides.
Okay, thank you, John. So the economy's output recovered in Q2, advancing annual rates of 4%. But even with this, economists are still lowering their 14 forecast based on the initial poor start to the year. CEOs are also seeing economy underperforming in the next 6 months, reflecting an underperforming economy held by policy uncertainty and growing world conflicts. And the IMF maintains a 3% growth outlook in 15, saying meaningful economic rebound is on its way. But the U.S. must cut spending and raise revenue to avoid public debt overwhelming countries' finances. So let's look at the macro inventory and sales trends. As you all may already know, inventory is a leading indicator. Higher inventory implies lower sales, and lower implies a business pickup. Higher inventory also indicates greater confidence in future sales. Looking at trade and sales manufacturing shipments for July 14, it was up 0.8% from June of 14, and up 5.3% compared to July of 2013. The adjusted manufacturers and trade inventories are up 0.4% from June to July of 14 and up 5.9% from July of 13. And looking at the inventory versus the sales ratio, we have the graph below. It shows how long existing inventories will last if the current rate of sales will continue.
Now, it's interesting to see the bubble that we had around 2008, 2009. That sticks out like a sore thumb. And while some of the trends that we hear suggest that everything is getting better, you do see a slight uptick, right, from 2012, 13 to 14, where we might indicate that, or that might indicate that inventories are up vis-a-vis sales because confidence is growing. But that also means that cash is tied up in inventory, so we need to be careful, especially in consumer product industries, for example, where there might be cyclical sales trends, or let's say that sales have picked up so rapidly over the last couple of years that demand could become saturated, right? Consumers have all the products they need in a particular category. Just some things to watch out for. You all are joining us from a number of diverse industries. You know your industry best and know to look out for those signals.
So before I turn it back over to John, let's take a quick look at the macro credit availability and the needs based on a survey done recently by various business owners. More business owners expect that it's going to be harder to arrange financer than easier going forward, with 4% reporting credit needs not met equal to record low. 28% reported credit needs met and at a record high, while 2% reported financing was top business problems compared to 24% citing taxes, while another 19% citing regulations and red tape and 13% citing weak sales. There's a more favorable reading about credit markets since 2006, this occurring when the Federal Reserve is terminating its aggressive QE3 policy. And interest rates are still low, but prospects for putting borrowed money, profitability to work are not great, so loan demands remain weak among business owners.
Right, and so watching the credit availability and what happens, you know, as the Federal Reserve continues to be involved, just leads to uncertainty as well, right? So we want to keep a good eye on that and determine how that's going to impact us as businesses, right? As a finance type, right, we look to low interest loans, right, to buy inventory, convert them into products, sell those products for a higher return. But as those as credit becomes tighter and those loans become more expensive, our cost of capital goes up. What does that mean? An impact to working capital, right? So let's take an impact, 2 slides on impact analysis. Where can we make adjustments to have the most impact on working capital? And these are somewhat prioritized by positive impacts to working capital in the organization. So, for example, overall, right, let's just call it the capstone area is working capital management, right? If you're not actively managing your working capital, conducting diagnostics and keeping an eye on the cash forecast, you could have a problem. Key elements, obviously, are planning, the diagnostics, and the metric measurement. The areas to focus are using the diagnostics, for example, to determine What are the optimal levels? Where can we get to? What kind of other third-party benchmarking information can we use to determine where we should be vis-a-vis our competitors? CFO.com tends to purchase a lot of good metrics, or excuse me, make available a lot of good metrics. So check that out. And of course, focus on your internal controls and accuracy reporting. The next is rationalizing and benchmark costs. This is where the majority of costs can be cut out, typically in strategic sourcing and procurement. For example, for those of you that are calling in from manufacturing companies, you'll know that about 60 to 80% of your spend tends to come from direct materials, right? So to the extent that you can leverage your supply base, squeeze it down to one or two core sources of supply, and take advantage of economies of scale, really can have significant impact. Indirect sourcing, right? What are you spending on services? What are you spending on overhead items and so forth? Do you have the ability to renegotiate some of those contracts to save money? More often than not, your suppliers are going to be willing to cut costs to keep the business than not. Now, the goal here isn't to establish a controversial relationship between yourself and your suppliers, because it should be more of a partnership. But to the extent that everybody can cut costs together, that's beneficial. That's what we really talk about when we see leveraging spend. And of course, there's some tactical things you can do in the area of procurement, such as deploying e-catalogs, procurement card usage, really as a means to increase control. But what you may not know, for example, procurement cards can often result in cash kickbacks from the banks that you're using. So driving things through procurement cards can result in savings and also cut down invoice processing costs, which leads us right into the next area perfectly, which is cash recovery and financial leakage, right? And we're really talking about AP and purchasing. This is one of the areas that I call low-hanging fruit. We typically start in this area and perform some basic analyses for our clients, typically on a contingent fee basis, to look at, do you have duplicate payments that you need to be going after? Over the years, we've recovered millions of dollars of cash for organizations who had no idea that they had paid their suppliers more than once, or that they had unused credit memos that they could be applying to vendor purchases. A lot of these challenges are created by weaknesses in the vendor master file, such as duplicate vendors, alternate addresses, and so forth. We see a lot of the same issues derived out of not consolidating invoices into one or two, paying for a lot of small dollar items as opposed to consolidating, and so forth. The other two areas are receivables and credit management, the key elements of which are obviously credit management itself, AR and cash collections. The areas to focus on are, do we have standard credit terms? Are we looking at the customers that we're taking on before we just extend them credit? So let's use the example I started off the webinar with, right? Consumer products industry. Demand is spiking. Our distributors want tons of products, or wholesalers want tons of product. We want them to have it. We're extending credit like mad so they can get it. Well, they're probably going to 3 or 4 of your competitors and doing the same thing. It's not uncommon for them to overextend themselves. So you really need to take a good look at that. How aggressive or conservative do you want to be with your customer acceptance? And you can monitor that, of course, with solid aging and review of receivables, cash collection. And the last area is really looking at your inventory, right? What we find more often than not to be of value in a significant area of cost cutting in inventory is alternative specifications. That is, sitting down with the original buyers or engineers and saying, listen, you spec'd out this raw material to have a tolerance of 0.005 level of error. Did you know that that's costing us X? Did you just specify that because that's a standard in engineering, or because that particular attribute has to be held that tightly? In a lot of instances, you find that there's some leeway there, and altering the technical specifications of the product that you're purchasing can result in millions of dollars of savings. All right. So on the next slide, you'll just see a graphical representation of what I had mentioned with respect to rationalizing and benchmarking costs. Right, in this particular example, we were able to cut a client's overhead expenditures by about 14%. What you see in the pie graph is, and this is really a small representation, but for a particular product type that they were buying, they had almost 20 sources of supply, and that's represented by the different colors. Now, over the year, that may sound a little bit surprising, but over the years, you don't realize how many different people approach the purchasing department and say, we need this, 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 and this. Well, that leads to one-time buyers or one-time suppliers. All of a sudden, the next time the buy comes around, you find out that you have two sources of supply, so you're buying from disparate sources. In short, we consolidated the supply base down to the 6 or so vendors that you see on the right side and cut about 14% of expense out. The next slide is really focused on cash recovery and financial leakage. Credit here to a webinar back in my prior days at Protiviti. I borrowed this image. But what we're going to show you is the impact of unused credit memos and early supplier payments. Whereas cost cutting and cost benchmarking can result in up to 15% of savings, so therefore, more dramatic, it tends to take a longer period of time to achieve that. The financial benefits of really squeezing accounts payable can give you up to 1% of spend, but it's low-hanging fruit and can be done very quickly. So the attributes we might focus on are, again, procurement card management, the controls around travel and entertainment expenditures. When's the last time that you've looked at the approval levels over certain types of expenditures in the company, right, as you've grown? Claims management, contract compliance, and of course, fraud management. The attributes within AP that we look for, I've touched on throughout the presentation, but you can see them here, right? And so let me just pick out a couple of them. In the graph you see below, early supplier payments. What we've done is we've stratified the number of days in aggregate where we've paid invoices early versus the terms. A lot of times that's driven by a manual accounts payable department where somebody's not taking advantage of a modern day AP system. Or companies that have multiple AP functions, right? They haven't consolidated into a shared service center. And so the data that they're using to determine what the supplier payment terms are all over the place. Well, what does that result in? In this particular instance, you see 31,000 invoices, or 18% of them were paid at least 5 days early. What does that mean? You're giving up your cash. For those of you that are working for, organizations with several $100 million in spend or $1 billion in spend, that equates to a significant amount of money. On the left-hand side, you just see an analysis of unused credit memos. It's not too often that they go unapplied as well. In this particular client instance, we found 443 total unused credit memos. They had $1.94 million of cash just sitting there that weren't being used. All right? Think of the same inside of your organization. So receivables and credit, we talked about this on prior slides, right? It comes down to how aggressive do you want to be. as credit is changing at a national level, and we're coming out of an economic slump, we really want to take a look at this and revisit it. Is there actually an opportunity to loosen credit policies as opposed to where they might have been in 2008 and 2009? So we can characterize a credit policy by either as aggressive or conservative. An aggressive credit policy is requiring higher current asset balance, right? Sales are generated through more significant extensions of customer credit. You tend to build more inventory vis-a-vis cash, right? And you're selling quicker than you're taking the cash in. A more conservative credit policy does just the opposite. All right. What are some of the facilitators to working capital improvements as it relates to receivables and credit? Shortening processing times, selling goods faster. Decreasing collection times to reduce AR collection period, and of course deferring payments where appropriate. So what about optimizing inventory? This is an area where sales, operations, and finance really should get together. Sales wants to be able to meet the demand of every customer, from the customer who buys 1 unit to the customer who buys 1 billion units, right? And so they want inventory readily available. Operations wants raw materials readily available so they can keep production going, whether or not there is demand. That gets dangerous because it builds up WIP and finished goods. And the finance guys take a look at that and they say, hey, wait a minute, all that inventory you're building? Well, it's not just tying up cash. There is a cost associated with that sometimes the sales and the operations folks may not know. So you got to ask yourself, how much is your inventory costing you? And maybe even step back to a very basic equation to show some of the other departments in the organization what the cost structure is. The cost of carrying inventory or holding inventory is a sum of the following costs. It's the cash that's tied up in inventory, such as the cost of capital or opportunity cost of money, right? If you're using cash to buy inventory and it's sitting there for a while, that means you're not investing the cash. You're not getting a return on that cash. Physical space occupied by inventory, including rent, depreciation, utility costs. We work with a number of companies over the past couple of years that have had to expand their warehouses because their inventory balances have grown so much. Well, they've got to recognize that those expenses should be calculated in inventory carrying costs. Costs of handling the items. So, for example, in the same situation, right, it requires labor to manage inventory, manage receiving functions, and shipping functions. And then the cost of deterioration or obsolescence. The standard rule of thumb for inventory carrying costs is somewhere between 20 and 30%, but of course that's going to vary by every business. Now here's an accounting view of inventory and the cash conversion cycle. You remember what I showed you earlier in the presentation about sales, operations, and finance all being involved. This is just a slightly different spin on it as it relates to cost to buy, hold, and sell inventory. Now, again, the numbers in here are going to vary by whether or not you're a small business or let's say you're $1 billion business. You could wind up adding some zeros on here, and that's significant. So in the leftmost picture, right, we show a current state situation. How much cash do we need, or what is our cash gap based upon the calculation of days in payable, days in inventory, and the days in accounts receivable. It's costing us about $3,000 a day just in interest to hold that inventory, which over a year results in several $100,000 of interest expense. That's just wasted funds. An improvement of about 9 days across that cash gap could result in $31,000 interest savings a year, or in a larger business, that could be $3.1 million. And all we've really done here in this particular example is we've extended out days payable. So taking a good look at the accounts payable function and the controls around your payables can show you how you can really impact your working capital. The remainder of this presentation is focused on a case study, a look at vendors and payables, and just some examples from a particular client. In this particular example, we really stripped apart the AP function and we looked at their invoice processing for a 12-month period. As you can see, over about a 1-year period, the number of invoices processed were growing significantly. Upwards of 66,000 invoices were being processed each year, which is a pretty extreme amount. Now, as we dug further into that detail, we found that approximately 33,000 or 50% of those invoices were for less than $1,000. And that only accounted for 3.9% of the dollars paid. Well, each of those invoices carries a processing cost, carries labor costs, right? Increases the opportunity for duplicate payments. So what was happening is they had to double the staff investment in their AP function to handle the increases in invoices submitted by their vendors, rather than taking a step back and looking and saying, hey, wait a minute. We have 42 sources of supply for this particular product. Let's consolidate those sources of supply down to 5. Let's tell those vendors to stop submitting 5 invoices a week as they ship each set of raw materials and give us one consolidated invoice at the end of the month, etc. So you'll see one of the bullets in there says one inventory submits 5,000 invoices per year. If you do the math in your head, that's several invoices every day, right? They should be consolidated down to 12 invoices a year from 5,000. The next is looking at the capability of your accounts payable function to manage cash. And what you see across the top there is a graphic. It's called a capability maturity model. All right, initial means that the organization is kind of completely ad hoc. Optimized is you're making use of the best systems there are. So some of the things that we noted are, I already mentioned the significant resources required to manage a high volume, small volume of transactions. Another solution to that, if those small dollar items are really needed, the organization could have deployed procurement cards, which, contrary to popular belief, actually increase expense control, not decrease it. Today's modern procurement cards come with the ability to limit not only spending amounts, but also by particular categories of spend, whereas the traditional invoice submission process and signature doesn't come with that level of control. The second bullet shows that the current benchmark of invoice processing costs is about $2.90, but because they had to increase the staff to manage all those invoices, it was estimated $8.50 per invoice. Right? That left very little time to manage working capital, to step back and say, what are our processing costs? What are our DPO? What does our working capital model look like? Because everybody was wrapped up in tactical activities. Right? They were also making poor use of technology. Their 3-way matching process was manual because they were not trusting the system. Today's modern systems allow for such things as ERS, or evaluated receipt settlement, where the system will do a match automatically and cut a check just based upon the information that's in the system. And of course, nobody in the department was certified by any of the top accounts payable professional associations and so forth. All right, the impact: lots of employees, weak transaction processing, millions of dollars of duplicate payments, discounts not applied, and unused credit memos. We think you get the idea. All right, and then the last thing is, we basically did a benchmark exercise for them. their primary issue was that they were 10 to 15 years behind in basic AP technology, and AP was being beaten down due to a slow process and failure to take discounts. Well, how could they take advantage of discounts when they're trying to manually manage 66,000 invoices or 5,000 from one vendor alone? So some of the best practices that I had mentioned already are as follows, right? Consolidating vendor invoices into one payment. If you get 5,000 invoices from a particular vendor, which hopefully you do not, you're not cutting 5,000 checks. That would be crazy. You're cutting 12 checks. Automatic payment of recurring invoices. So for things like utilities, not using manual labor to process fixed amounts that are coming from service providers. Taking full advantage of vendor discount terms, using procurement cards for small dollar purchases, using evaluated receipt settlement, error tracking system to address exceptions, right? One of the things that we found in this particular case study was the invoices were not matching. And so what the AP clerks were doing is they would take the invoices and put them off to the side of their desk. Eventually they went from the side of their desk to a drawer, and from a drawer to a closet. They had a number of invoices where they were not taking advantage of the credit terms or the discount terms. Now you could joke and say that, right, they weren't outlaying any cash because they weren't paying the invoices, but the ultimate goal there is to take advantage of the discount terms. So if you're just pushing to the side all of the unmatched invoices to your POs and not taking advantage of those terms or not analytically measuring them, you're passing up on opportunities. Revisiting approval limits based upon risk and materiality limits. Considering outsourcing check runs as opposed to processing them internally because it's a non-value-added function. Making use of online systems and catalogs for vendor purchasing. Automated files to show history of items, quantity, and price to make sure that you are monitoring price escalation. Paperless requisitioning to check process, and of course online approval of vendor invoices. It's not too often to see a company that gets vendor invoices in, they stick them in intercompany mail, despite the days of email and automated workflow, and they route it around the company and they miss the discount period again. Right? So we're throwing a lot at you, I apologize, but hopefully the takeaway from this particular case study shows that in areas just like AP alone, taking an internal look at how you're processing POs and invoices can have a pretty big impact on working capital. So what should you do immediately after this webinar? Short-term actions. Benchmark and optimize your cost structure. Where do you really stand, right? So your CFO is probably continuing to say, well, we got to get costs down. We got to manage our costs and so forth. But what is optimal? How do you know what it is? There's organizations out there such as APQC, which provides benchmarks as to what others are spending in particular areas and what their processing costs. Of course, you can look at your competitors' expenses as well to the extent they're public and that information is available. The next step is consider strategic sourcing and procurement optimization. Kind of just got to ask yourself, why wouldn't you do that? Why not take an opportunity to increase profits and cash? And consider an immediate payable analysis. Right, if you're to use a firm like Orchid Advisors or even some of the others that do this, it can be done on a contingent fee basis, where all we need is a couple of data files to find out if you have duplicate payments, and if cash is recovered, well, that's great. Long-term actions that you can take are accelerating the overall conversion of working capital by looking on the cycle, getting analytical with your scenario-based cash flow forecasting. Implementing zero-based budgeting is one of my favorite because, as you all know, you go through the annual budgeting cycle, and the first thing you do is you take out last year's budget and last year's expenditures and you just tweak it so that you can submit it in and somebody approves it. Sometimes it's really advantageous to wipe that entire slate clean and justify why do you need to spend on any of those things, right? That's called zero-based budgeting. Start with zero, don't start with last year's budget. Analyzing credits, contract purchasing and payables controls, assessing outsourcing and insourcing opportunities, and of course, developing exit strategies for unprofitable products and loss leaders. That is our presentation for today. I see that we're just coming up to the noon hour. I don't have any questions that have come in. Why don't we wait just a moment or two? If not, I want to thank you all for being patient and for joining us today. And if you have any questions, you can see our email address is contactus@orchidadvisors.com. And the webinar will be made available on our website. And if you want to save some cash or increase profits, give us a call. All right, that's it, and thank you very much.